In the mouth of the Rhine, the Titan gates are the only thing protecting the lowlands from a rising North Sea. These 6-story steel walls are controlled by a hydraulic brain so complex, it takes a supercomputer to move them. But when a freak lightning strike fused the primary circuits and a 30-foot storm surge bore down on the sleeping cities, the gates stayed open. This is the story of Copper, a scrappy Abyssinian with a coat like burnished wire, and the night he entered the crush zone to save a nation. The Guardian of the Deadlock. Chapter 1: The Resident of the Rivets. The Titan Gate stood as the final line of defense for the Netherlands, a series of colossal steel fans designed to swing shut and seal the Rhine against the fury of the North Sea. They were a marvel of hydraulic power, supported by massive hollow spheres that allowed them to float and rotate on pivots the size of houses. To a human, the gatehouse was a cathedral of echoing metal and the smell of hot grease. To Copper, it was a vertical playground. He was an Abyssinian with a coat the color of a new penny, a living spark of fire in a world of battleship grey. Copper wasn't a pet in the traditional sense, he was a self-appointed member of the engineering team. While other cats were content with the soft cushions of a farmhouse, Copper craved the vibration of the 6-story pistons. He had learned to navigate the complex web of catwalks and high-tension cables that crisscrossed the ceiling, moving with a jittery, high-energy grace that matched the hum of the machinery. His paws were permanently stained with the faint, metallic scent of industrial lubricants, and he seemed to find the roar of the pumps more soothing than a lullaby. The engineers, led by a veteran named Elias, treated Copper as their primary vibration sensor. It was an unscientific but highly accurate method of monitoring the health of the gates. If Copper was stretched out on the primary control console, the system was running within optimal parameters. If he sat upright with his ears swiveled toward the basement, it meant a bearing was overheating. But when Copper abandoned the floor entirely to perch on the highest rusted rivets of the ceiling, the crew knew that a storm of historic proportions was brewing out in the Atlantic. Copper's hunting grounds were the narrow service crawl spaces where no human could fit. He kept the deadlock, the central junction where the hydraulic lines converged, free of the invasive rats that tried to chew through the insulation. He was a creature of the infrastructure, his Abyssinian fur camouflaging him perfectly against the burnished copper pipes. He understood the language of the machine, the hiss of steam, the clunk of the locking pins, and the deep, rhythmic thrum of the tide against the external hull. As the sky over the North Sea turned a bruised, sickly green, Copper retreated to the highest rafter. He watched as the team scrambled to calibrate the automated closing sequence. The air in the gatehouse grew heavy with the smell of ozone and the approaching salt spray. The engineers checked their monitors, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. They were preparing to face a surge that had been building for 3,000 miles, unaware that their most reliable sensor was already bracing for a total system collapse. Chapter 2: The Surge of the Century. The Storm Valkyrie was a meteorological nightmare, a low-pressure system so deep it literally pulled the surface of the ocean upward into a mountain of water. It pushed a 30-foot wall of the North Sea toward the coast, moving with the unstoppable momentum of 1,000 freight trains. At the Titan gates, the alarm bells began a frantic, rhythmic shriek. Elias initiated the closing sequence, and the massive hydraulic pumps began to groan as they prepared to move the 10,000-ton gates into the path of the waves. Then, the sky cracked. A massive bolt of blue lightning, carrying 1 billion joules of energy, bypassed the primary lightning rods and struck the main communications tower. The surge traveled down the copper lines like a fiery snake, entering the gatehouse and exploding into the primary control processors. A spray of sparks lit up the room as the digital brain of the gates fused into a useless mass of slag. The Titan was suddenly lobotomized, the gates remained wide open, frozen in place as the first white caps of the surge appeared on the horizon. The panic in the control room was instantaneous. Without the computer, the automated valves wouldn't open, and the pressure in the lines remained locked. Elias slammed his fists against the unresponsive console, but the screens were dead. Outside, the roar of the ocean was becoming a deafening, physical force. If the gates didn't close in the next 12 minutes, the surge would funnel into the Rhine, overtopping the inland dikes and flooding the sleeping cities under 20 feet of freezing seawater. Elias looked out the reinforced viewport at the approaching wall of water. It was a terrifying, frothing line of destruction, cutting through the darkness with its own bioluminescent fury. Every backup system had been fried by the strike. There was no way to command the gates from the safety of the control room. The only option left was the manual bleed, a mechanical bypass located in the heart of the hydraulic throat. But that area was now a pressurized death trap, filled with leaking steam and toxic hydraulic mist. From his high rafter, Copper watched the humans. He saw Elias grab a heavy brass wrench and a flashlight, his hand shaking as he realized the impossibility of the task. The crawl space to the manual valve was only 12 inches wide and partially flooded with hot oil. Elias was too large to fit, and his youngest engineer was too terrified to move. The gates were the only thing that could stop the Valkyrie wave, but the Titan was paralyzed by its own complexity, a giant waiting to be drowned by a cat. Chapter 3: The Manual Bleed. Elias looked from the narrow, smoking hatch to the orange cat perched above him. He knew the layout of the bypass. It was a labyrinth of steel tubes and high-pressure sensors that ended at the suicide valve, the red wheel that could manually dump the hydraulic fluid into the reservoir, allowing gravity to drop the gates. "Copper," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "You've been in there 1,000 times for the rats. You have to go in one more time for us." He took a heavy brass wrench and used a roll of industrial tape to secure it to a harness on Copper's back. He also attached a small LED light to the cat's collar, casting a narrow beam into the dark, hissing tunnel. Copper sniffed the air, his pupils dilating as he sensed the danger. The hydraulic mist was a thick, yellow fog that tasted of chemicals and heat. It was an environment that would kill a human in minutes, but Copper was a resident of the rivets. He understood the pipes. Elias opened the hatch, and a jet of hot, oily air sprayed out. Copper recoiled for a second, his ears flattening, but he didn't run. He looked at Elias, seeing the desperation in the old man's eyes. Then, with a sudden, purposeful leap, he dove into the crush zone. The interior of the pipe was slick with high-grade lubricant, making Copper's fur instantly matted and heavy. He moved with a sliding, frantic crawl, his carbon fiber harness clinking against the steel walls. Inside the bypass, the sound was overwhelming. The storm surge was already hitting the outer hull of the gates, and the vibration was like being inside a giant drum. Copper had to navigate past leaking steam vents that hissed with lethal heat and spinning shafts that threatened to snag his fur. The wrench on his back felt like a mountain, but he used the weight to his advantage, sliding through the oily downward slopes of the pipe. He was a small, orange spark of life moving through the mechanical guts of a dying god. He reached the final junction. The suicide valve was located behind a heavy pressure grate that was partially warped from the electrical surge. Copper squeezed his body through the bars, his Abyssinian frame twisting with an agility that no machine could replicate. He stood in the valve chamber, the air so thick with hydraulic vapor that his LED light could barely penetrate the gloom. There, in the center of the room, was the red wheel, the only thing standing between the North Sea and the heart of the country. Chapter 4: Into the Crush Zone. The valve chamber was a scene of industrial ruin. The electrical strike had caused a secondary explosion in a nearby capacitor, and the floor was covered in a soup of oil and shattered glass. Copper struggled to find his footing, his paws sliding on the slick metal. He looked up at the red wheel. It was located 4 feet above the floor, and it was jammed by a piece of metal shrapnel that had wedged into the spokes. Copper let out a low, defiant growl, the sound lost in the roar of the approaching tide. Outside, the first wave of the surge hit the Titan gates. The massive steel structures groaned as they took the impact, the sheer force of the water trying to push them further open. The vibration in the valve chamber became a violent shaking, throwing Copper against the wall. He scrambled back to the wheel, his fur now black with grease, his amber eyes fixed on the red iron. He knew he had to turn it, or the crush zone would live up to its name as the gates were ripped from their hinges. Copper used the pipes as a ladder, climbing until he was level with the wheel. He bit into the paracord of his harness and pulled the brass wrench free. He didn't have the hands to grip the tool, but he had the instinct of a mechanic. He wedged the handle of the wrench between 2 of the spokes, creating a lever that extended outward. Then, he climbed onto the end of the wrench, his entire 15-pound weight hanging off the brass handle like a pendulum. The wheel didn't budge. The shrapnel was wedged deep into the gear assembly. Copper jumped, adding the force of momentum to his weight, but the metal only groaned. He tried again, his muscles screaming with the effort, his lungs burning from the toxic fumes. He was a small creature fighting against 1,000 tons of jammed machinery. He looked toward the hatch, but he knew there was no going back. He had to be the strength that the Titan no longer possessed. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Copper climbed to the highest pipe in the chamber. He looked at the wrench, calculated the distance, and launched himself into the air. He hit the end of the wrench with the force of a falling stone, his body absorbing the impact. Crack! The piece of shrapnel snapped, and the red wheel began to spin. The sound of high-pressure fluid rushing through the lines was like a scream of relief as the deadlock finally broke. Chapter 5: The Turn of the Tide. As the hydraulic pressure bled out, the massive counterweights in the gatehouse were released. Outside, the engineers watched in stunned silence as the Titan gates, once frozen and useless, began to move. Slowly, then with increasing speed, the 10,000-ton steel fan swung through the water. They moved with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very bedrock of the coast. The mouth of the Rhine was finally closing, just seconds before the main body of the surge arrived. The gates slammed into their silt beds with a sound like a falling skyscraper. The impact sent a plume of white spray 100 feet into the air, but the seal held. A second later, the 30-foot wall of the Valkyrie wave hit the gates. The North Sea exploded against the steel, 1,000,000 tons of water trying to find a gap, but the Titan gates stood firm. The surge was broken, its energy diverted back toward the sea, while the inland dikes remained dry and silent. Inside the valve chamber, Copper was thrown from the wrench by the force of the gates closing. He landed in the oily sludge, the air suddenly clearing as the pressure drop sucked the toxic mist out of the vents. He lay there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his orange fur matted and unrecognizable. He had done what the supercomputers couldn't, he had found the one mechanical weakness in the system and forced it to obey. He was the hero of the hydraulic throat. Elias scrambled to the hatch, his heart hammering in his chest. He pulled the emergency release, and a cloud of steam billowed out. "Copper," he shouted, his voice echoing through the pipes. He reached his arm into the dark, feeling through the oil and the glass. His fingers brushed against something warm and shivering. He pulled the cat out, cradling the blackened, oily bundle against his chest. Copper let out a faint, raspy meow, his amber eyes opening to see the blue emergency lights of the gatehouse. The cities were safe. The Valkyrie wave would be recorded in history as the storm that nearly broke the Netherlands, but the engineers knew the truth. They looked at the small cat in Elias's arms, the brass wrench still tangled in his harness. They had built a machine that could move mountains, but they had forgotten that a machine is only as good as the heart that keeps it running. Today, the Titan gates had a new heart, and it was covered in grease and Abyssinian fur, the steel curtain. In the aftermath of the storm, the Port Authority tried to conduct an official investigation into how the gates were manually triggered. They brought in teams of experts and forensic analysts, who were baffled by the brass wrench found in the sub-basement and the orange hairs caught in the valve gears. Elias never told them the full story, some things were too incredible for a government report. He simply told them that the system found a way to save itself. Copper was given a hero's treatment, though he didn't seem to care for the medals or the press. He was taken to a specialized veterinary clinic where his fur was meticulously cleaned of the hydraulic oil. His Abyssinian coat eventually returned to its burnished copper glow, though he kept a few small scars on his paws as a reminder of the crush zone. He returned to the gatehouse 3 weeks later, walking across the control room floor with the same jittery, high-energy grace as before. The Titan gates were upgraded with a new, lightning-proof fiber optic system, but the engineers insisted on keeping the manual bypass exactly as it was. They also installed a new feature, a gold-plated food bowl in the center of the control room, engraved with the image of a cat and a wrench. Copper was given permanent Level 1 access to every part of the facility, and a small, cat-sized hatch was added to the hydraulic throat, just in case the Titan ever needed a hand again. Today, if you visit the mouth of the Rhine, you can see the Titan gate standing tall against the horizon, a steel curtain that keeps the world at bay. Inside the gatehouse, the engineers still watch the orange cat for signs of trouble. They know that as long as Copper is patrolling the rivets, the lowlands are safe. He is the guardian of the deadlock, the master of the gears, and the living proof that no matter how big the storm, it's the small things that truly matter. As the sun sets over the North Sea, casting a long, golden shadow from the gates across the water, Copper sits on the highest rafter. He looks out at the waves, his amber eyes reflecting the calm of a sea that has been tamed. He lets out a contented purr, a sound that harmonizes with the deep, steady thrum of the pumps. The world is safe, the gates are steady, and the resident of the rivets is finally at rest. Copper was a small creature in a world of 6-story steel, but he was the only one who could reach the heart of the machine. He proved that even the biggest problems can be solved by the smallest heroes. If Copper's bravery at the floodgates gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe to Paws that saved lives. We bring you the most thrilling stories of animal courage. Comment gate below if you think our pets are the real heroes of our homes.